Well, welcome everyone. My name is Sarah Hansen, and I am the executive director here at the White Bear Lake Area Historical Society. And I can't tell you how good this feels to see all of you here, which sounds really strange. But this has been a vision and a dream of ours for many years to try to work toward transforming the Armory into a history center. And the fact that we literally are going to have to buy more chairs is a good problem. So thank you. Dan said this earlier while folks were arriving, and some of you may have heard it, but I will repeat. For 15 years, we did these programs at the White Bear Lake Library, and they were fantastic. We were thrilled. We didn't have a place to do them, and they were wonderful. And whenever we did Gangsters, it was a no-brainer. Whenever we did Gangsters, we'd fill up the room. Gangsters, boat builders, and Prohibition, usually. I'm not sure what they all have in common. Jay. But either way, we knew we would have a good crowd tonight. I didn't quite expect this good of a crowd, so thank you for all for coming and being a part of this. Dan Jones is our creative director in the back there, who is working the camera to make sure that we can try to record this. He's also responsible for many of our things, including graphics on the PowerPoints, the insert I was talking about in the White Bear Press a little while ago, and lots of other things. So without Dan, we wouldn't look pretty. We'll leave it at that. And without any further ado, I'm going to dive in because I think we're all a little warm in here. And folks are waiting for the show. So we'll go ahead and go. I want to start by saying thank you to the residents of Minnesota and the Clean Water Land and Legacy Amendment that was passed in 2008. Funding from that provided some of the research for this project or for this program. We've done gangster programs for many years now. We were able to get a grant a few years ago and enhance and dive a little deeper into certain things, and I'll talk about some of that as we go. And then, of course, the members of the White Bear Lake Area Historical Society, because without our members, we wouldn't be able to do any of the things that we're doing here at the Armory or the Philip Brown House or the White Bear Town Hall or anywhere else for that matter. So we'll go ahead and dive in. Now, Dan put the stamp on there, I didn't. But I always start these programs with a disclaimer because as a historian, this topic always got to me. I didn't like gangsters. I didn't like telling these stories, or some of these stories. And of course, it's a popular one, as you can all see. But from a history standpoint, it's challenging because by the nature of what gangsters did, they didn't keep a lot of evidence. They didn't want receipts and photos and documents and all the things that I get really excited about. So as we try to verify stories, that can be really, really difficult. We have had a lot of luck, fortunately. At about 2008, 2009, I had started with the Historical Society in 2001. And people asked us for gangster stuff all the time. And I couldn't do it. I couldn't justify it. But as we went along, and if you ever have weird sound stuff, wave at me and I'll adjust as best we can. Anyway, as we went along, around that same time, I came across something that was truly fascinating. And I know that all of you are going to think I'm crazy, which is fair. You don't have to actually read it. I'll read it to you. But this is a screenshot from a page of minutes from the White Bear Town Board. Now, the White Bear Town Board was for White Bear Township, which was most of the area on the Ramsey County side of the lake today. In 1932, and on May 2nd, 1932, at their town board meeting, so like their city council meeting, the town board issued a dance permit for a $20 fee granted to the following, to wit, Ben Harris of the Plantation. The Plantation was a dance club over where Lions Park, where Lions Park is today. So Kowalski's is down in the lower left there, the marina area on White Bear Lake. That's Lions Park. That's where the Plantation was located. And in 1932, that was part of White Bear Township still. It wasn't part of the city of White Bear Lake. Now, for whatever reason, that little notation, and he did it for a few years, and there were other things that popped up with his name associated with the Plantation, caught my attention because Ben Harris was a known gang associate. So I was like, oh, there's a document. It might not have anything to do with anything illegal. He was getting a dance hall permit, which you had to have in 1932 to operate a dance hall like he was doing at the Plantation. But that was enough to start pulling threads. Thankfully for us, about that same time, the the FBI actually digitized many of their records, lots of their, if you don't get enough gangster things tonight from me, go home and get on the computer and go to the vault.gov, I believe it is, but you can Google it, you'll find it. But they have all sorts of the actual files, so their fingerprint cards and their arrest records, transcripts of interviews with witnesses and all sorts of things that are out there. And then along that same line, the Minnesota Historical Society went through the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension for the state and did the same thing. So there are documents out there that we can track. Now, of course, they are not the fancy, exciting stories of the fanciful stories of some of the things they were doing, but they certainly helped us piece together certain elements of it. The other side of that coin is that you'll hear a little bit about Elvin Karpus in a few minutes, and he was able to actually be alive and tell his stories. He survived this whole era, which you'll hear in a minute. And so to be able to take those stories, his versions of the stories, some of the other accounts of the things that were going on, and then the official government records of things, and kind of weave them together, we've been able to put together a pretty decent piece of information. So that's where we will start tonight. Give you a little bit of context what was going on. My glasses keep sliding down. To give you a little bit of context of what was going on, I just want to show that White Bear Lake certainly was not the only place around that had challenges with gangsters. This is literally just a map. Those dots don't mean anything, so don't panic. Like there were big gangs all over in each of those towns or anything. They're just towns, but there were activities going on all over the Midwest. That was absolutely for sure in the 1920s and 1930s, and really. It's been described as a crime wave like none that had been seen before, and both in the big cities and the small towns. According to the FBI records, and this could be a bit exaggerated, but you never know. According to the FBI records, there were 1,300 gangs, not gangsters, but individual, separate, organized groups of gangs around the Midwest, and particularly highlighted in Chicago in the mid-1920s. By 1926, 12,000 murders were taking place across America each year, so about 1,000 a month because of gang activity. Most scholars agree that the crime spree was if not caused by Prohibition, certainly helped by Prohibition. Hold on, let's not jump quite that fast. There we go. Which, of course, was known as the Noble Experiment. Prohibition was ratified by Congress on January 16th, 1919, and it went into effect a full year later, if you can imagine. So January of 1920, it went into effect. Now, it's interesting. Prohibition itself was known as the Volstead Act and named for one of our representatives from Minnesota. He was not necessarily a teetotaler, by the way, but for a lot of reasons, economic in particular, he felt this was a good thing to do. So it was actually written and named for him. But Prohibition itself, as it was written and passed, was almost impossible to enforce, which is one of those lovely things, right? So essentially, the way it was written, and I won't get into great dregs of this, but the way it was written, you could own alcohol. You just couldn't transfer it, make it, sell it, do anything with it. But if you had it, you could legally consume it. So they passed the law in 1919 and gave you a whole year to do what? And that's exactly what people did, or who wanted to have alcohol at least. So that was no big shock. Unfortunately, for many folks, they didn't think Prohibition would last as long as it did. So by the middle of the 1920s, it had been going on for 5 or 6 years. It ended up lasting for 13 years, which is why, as we go through the end of the 1920s and into the early 1930s, things get a little twitchy and desperate for those who wanted to be able to have alcohol. Now, if you wanted to do it legally, the only way you could get alcohol during Prohibition was through a medical prescription, which you see here. This is one of my favorite things. We show this all the time, but it is a prescription for whiskey, believe it or not. But it's very local. It is for John O. Johnson, the founder of the Johnson Boat Works. And it is It is written, let me make sure I get this right. It is written by Dr. Voges, who was a local doctor, and filled by Clarence Swearens, who had the White Bear drugstore in town. So, but what's fascinating, that's all fun. And he was, we're poking fun, and the Johnson family gave this prescription, this photo to us, but we're poking fun at them, but this was not uncommon. My great-grandfather was actually a doctor during this time period, and we have his prescription books. They had the tear-off prescriptions like this, but then you had to record to whom you had written it and for what and all of that. We have some of his, and people were coming, I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing, but people were coming from Iowa, South Dakota, North Dakota, all over the place, St. Paul to get prescriptions. Which is a little bit unusual, but whatever. Anyway, you didn't have to go that far, I'm fairly certain, but oh well. So what's interesting about this, though, so like I said, they were very well recorded and captured. If you look at the edges of the prescription itself, you can see information about the U.S. Treasury Department, for example. Alcohol was regulated by the Treasury Department, so that it was a very serious thing. But like I say, unfortunately, it was hard to actually control and whatnot. Now, it was the bootlegging of alcohol that made the gangsters so popular and so wealthy and so powerful as time went on. And St. Paul was a hotspot for all of that for a number of reasons. So here's a quote from, so this is Elvin Karpis, and you'll see him more. We'll talk more about him as we go. But as I mentioned a minute ago, he was one of the few who was left standing, really the last man standing, if you will. He was arrested instead of killed as they tried to capture him. And so he wrote, he sat down with writers and wrote his biography, and there were movies, A&E movies done about A&E biographies, and other movies, documentaries and different things done. So his story was told over and over. Now, keep in mind, it was his version of the story, but he was the last man standing, so he had to have something to, boast about, I guess. But one of my favorite quotes from his book, one of his books, is, of all the Midwest cities, the one that I knew the best was St. Paul, and it was a crook's haven. Every criminal of any importance in the 1930s made his home at one time or another in St. Paul. If you were looking for a guy you hadn't seen for a few months, you usually thought of two places: prison or St. Paul. If he wasn't locked up in one, he was probably hanging out in the other. Not sure this is a good thing, but it was what it was. This is about 1930, what St. Paul looked like at that point. Looks pretty respectable to me, but the main reason for this reputation was this gentleman, John O'Connor. He was the police chief prior to Prohibition. So he was not around during Prohibition. A lot of folks get that part confused. He was the police chief prior to Prohibition, but he set into place a situation called the O'Connor Layover Agreement, or the O'Connor System. And this was a publicly known thing. He was the police chief, and he instituted the system that if you were a criminal and you came to St. Paul, you had to check in at the police station, let them know you were there, promise not to do any do anything while you were within the city limits, anything illegal within the city limits, and basically they would leave you alone. Now, this started, and it started out fairly well. He actually put it into the annual reports for the city that he made to the city council about how he had lowered crime within the city limits with this program. That may have been true, and it probably was to some extent, but unfortunately for places like Minneapolis and South St. Paul and all the places around where all these gangsters would then run off and do their stuff and then rush back to St. Paul for sort of a free opportunity, they didn't love that, as you can imagine. And then the other piece is that, of course, it was ripe for corruption. So as time went on and the whole process sort of evolved, number two on the piece there started to come into play, where they would leave some sort of a host gift when they checked in at City Hall or at the police station. And then they'd get a little extra information, maybe warnings of folks' raids coming or things like that. So now White Bear was not the same. We did not have the same things going on, or our law enforcement was not engaging in these things. But as always with anything, with the resorts and just being so close and accessible via the railroad and all of that, we were still an extension of St. Paul in many, many ways, just like we are today. So we have several notorious figures, if you will, who were who were very well known to have been around here. We see Elvin Karpus on the upper left there, and then we see the Barker gang, or at least part of the Barker gang, here as well. So Ma Barker, and then those are 3 of her 4 sons. The whole crew is here. Interestingly, originally there were 4. Initially, there were 4 Barker sons. Ma was born or known as Arizona Donnie Clark and went by the name Kate. I have no idea. But if you try to figure out the names of the gangsters by any sort of logic, good luck. So I wouldn't bother. She married a gentleman named George Barker in 1892, and she was known to be fiercely defensive of her sons. There are stories that have been passed down from local law enforcement, where they grew up primarily in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and other places. But if her kids got in trouble, if the boys got in trouble and they were being held at the jail, she would go in and scream at the sheriff or the marshal or whomever was there until he would release them. She would basically just throw a tantrum until she got them out of jail. I can't imagine why they turned out to be a little challenged. Herman, the oldest, was committing residential burglaries as a teenager and taught his brother Lloyd, the second oldest, the tricks of the trade. All of the boys, all 4, were sloppy and careless with their crime sprees, and all would eventually be caught and serve time at various prisons. Herman did time at the Minnesota State Prison in Stillwater, so just down the road. In 1927, and they did multiple different sentences. In 1927, Herman escaped from the Arkansas jail where he was being held by fatally shooting an officer in the back. During their getaway, Herman and another escapee were pulled over for speeding. As the police officer approached the side window of the vehicle, Herman shot him in the face. His passenger jumped out and shot the officer's partner, and the 2 outlaws fled. The second officer was not fatally wounded and managed to shoot back and hit Herman while he was driving. He veered off the road, got out, staggered about a bit, and fell into the weeds, and then pulled out his gun and shot himself. So not a happy ending. None of them, frankly, have happy endings, which I'm sure is not shocking to you. So that was son number 1. Number 2, Lloyd, didn't do so well. He eventually struck out on his own and was imprisoned for his role in a mail train robbery in 1922. He served 16 years behind bars. That was a really long sentence. A lot of folks were getting out after a few years for crimes against humans that were a lot more harsh, if you ask me. But he served 16 years behind bars and was released from prison in 1938. He worked as a U.S. Army cook in a POW camp and met his end when he was murdered by his wife in 1949. When the police interviewed her later after the shooting, she said that she feared he would kill her or her children someday, so she decided to take care of it when he got home. Again, not a good ending. These are not super fabulous folks, so as you can tell. Arthur, or otherwise known as Doc, and not because he was the smartest, tool and the sharpest tool in the shed. Doc was involved in a series of bank robberies and auto thefts that led to his arrest on multiple occasions. It seemed he was generally released after a few months. He was also the first to participate in murder, which cost him 10 years in prison in Oklahoma. He was released in 1931 and continued a crime spree across the country until the authorities caught up with him in January of 1935, and he was convicted of the Bremer kidnapping, which you'll hear more about in a little bit. Doc was sent to Alcatraz eventually, where he, along with 2 other inmates, attempted to escape in 1939, and he was shot, mortally shot during the escape. So he didn't end up too well either. And then Freddie was known to be the most violent and vicious of the Barkers. He liked to kill at random and had an eerie laugh that would erupt out of nowhere. He had 4 gold teeth and was always thought to be Ma's favorite. He was the baby, which is not entirely shocking. So Elvin Karpus, who you see on the right, was part of this group. He met some of the brothers in prison, and then they all network and come together. So Elvin was part of the group, and he got, trying to figure out which part to dive into now. Essentially, let me start out by saying that, so Ma, Alvin was very jealous. Let's put it that way. So Ma was was publicized to be the ringleader of the gang. Okay. Alvin was very offended by that because, as he put it, he loved to tell his stories. And so another of his quotes says, "Ma was always somebody in our lives. Love didn't enter into it, really. She was somebody we looked after and took with us when we moved city to city, hideout to hideout. It is no insult to Ma's memory that she just didn't have the know-how to direct us on a robbery. It would not have occurred to her to get involved in our business, and we always made it a point of only discussing our scores when Ma wasn't around. We'd leave her at home when we were arranging a job, or we'd send her to a movie. Ma saw a lot of movies." And another simpler quote is, "Ma couldn't plan breakfast." So Alvin was very offended because J. Edgar Hoover, who was the head of the Bureau of Investigation, eventually the FBI, liked to promote that Ma was this big criminal mastermind and that she was the ringleader and she was in charge, and that's why they had to capture her or take her out. And Karpus thought that was a bunch of hooey because he, certainly felt like he was the one who came up with all the things and all the different plans, I guess. So that you'll see how this sort of progresses out as we go. But so Karpus, you see here in one of his mugshots, his nickname was Creepy, often said because of his sinister smile, which isn't too bad in that one, but you'll see a few more shots of him as we go. His career began early, like many of his cohorts. By the age of 10, he was associated with bootleggers, pimps, and bank robbers. It was while he was serving time in the Kansas State Penitentiary in Lansing, Kansas, that he met Fred Barker, who was serving time for bank robbery. When Karpus was released in 1931, he joined up with the Barker gang. Karpus's quiet, methodical nature complemented Fred's reckless, violent side. The group was led by Alvin, in his words, who claimed to have a photographic memory and was described as super smart by fellow gang member Fred Hunter, or Fred Barker. I'm not sure they're the greatest judge of intelligence, but still, you never know. He certainly was a fairly smart fella. The gang, at most times, there were about 20 to 25 members of the gang roaming around, if you will, of each of these gangs. So that was a pretty typical number. When they were out here at White Bear, they stayed in a few different places. This is one of the cottages. This was the summer of 1932. They rented what was then known as the Lambert Cottage, and you can see where the X is. It's just off the end, just if you were heading around the north end of the lake from White Bear Lake into through Delwood and into Mahtomedi. It's right on the edge of Delwood and Mahtomedi, if that makes sense, if you go past the peninsula there. This cottage no longer stands. There's a newer, more modern house on that site, and it's a long driveway. You can't see it, so you're not missing anything when you try to look and all you see are trees, but that is the location of it. During the summer of 1932, Alvin, Ma, and her son Fred arrived at the cottage, which looks a little bigger than a cottage, but on the shore of White Bear Lake on the 9th of July. Ma Barker, who was going under the alias Mrs. Hunter, Fred Barker, and Alvin Karpus claimed they were a mother, Mrs. Hunter, and her two sons, Freddie and Raymond. The Lamberts were headed to Scotland on holiday and were very particular about who they were going to rent to for the summer. When they returned, Mrs. Lambert told reporters that when they moved in, we told them we never allowed liquor on the place, or parties, or carousing, and there never was any. I don't know how she knew. She was in Scotland. But there probably wasn't, because they were just laying low. They were always quiet and very expensively dressed and drove expensive autos, which probably should have been a heads up, because a lot of folks didn't have money at that time with the Depression going on. The home was the home at the lake was in addition to a hideout they had in St. Paul, where they were laying low because they had just taken part in the bank robbery that's mentioned in this headline here, from Missouri. They had robbed a Kansas City bank, the Citizens National Bank in Fort Scott, Kansas, of $47,000. And during the heist, they kidnapped two bystanders to deter a police shootout, hurled nails on the road to puncture police tires, and escaped. Several of the gangsters were captured on a golf course nearby, but the Barker-Karpus crew got away to St. Paul. Ma Barker and Helen Ferguson, one of the girlfriends of one of the gangsters, were anxiously awaiting their return at the Lambert cottage. When they returned after 5 or 6 days, they had a lot of money because they had stopped and done a couple other heists. And during their stay at White Bear, the gangsters were then visited by many people. Can't imagine why, in high-powered and expensive automobiles, or at least that's what the witnesses reported in their interviews afterwards. On August 12th, 1932, so just about a month, little over a month later after they had arrived, a visitor came to the cottage and spoke hastily with Mrs. Hunter, who then told others that they had just received a telegram about some sickness in the family in the East and that they had to go. Not 48 hours later, of course, the FBI was there, the feds were there raiding the cottage. So clearly they had been tipped off by someone as they hustled out of town. So the other spot, and this one does still exist, you can see a picture somewhat of down in the corner there. If you can't see it up close, let me know and we can put it back up afterwards if people are interested. But this is Idlewild Cottage, which is on Bald Eagle Lake. And if you go to Bald Eagle, if you take, everyone hates my directions, so I apologize now. If you head north on 61 and take a left on Buffalo Street and follow it till you hit Bald Eagle Lake and you take a right, you follow Bald Eagle Boulevard around. When the road curves away from the lake and turns into Taylor, that house is sitting on the corner. That's the best way I can describe it. And again, if that's confusing, I can help fill that in later. But so as I've said before, generally the time that they've spent here was quiet. They were planning things. They were laying low from a previous heist, whatever. They weren't necessarily committing crimes in our area. So they were fairly welcomed. Idlewild is a spot that they rented in 1933. So if you keep in mind that they were at the Delwood Cottage in summer 1932 for a good 5 weeks or so, with the name Hunter as their alias, they now show up at the Idlewild Cottage in Bald Eagle, which is just really a few miles away, as the Wilson family. Don't ask me. But again, people really wanted to look the other way. These were not easy times in the world, in particular, and they weren't necessarily causing trouble when they were here, or at least at this point they weren't. And so folks were willing to look the other way. They often came to town and were willing to pay 4 or 5 times what you were asking to rent the cottage, pay in cash, pay up front. It was hard to turn down. So a lot of people didn't turn it down. Jack Pfeiffer, who is kind of the connector, the fixer guy, he worked at the Hollyhocks Club in St. Paul, or had the Hollyhocks Club in St. Paul, which was another notable gangster hangout. And Karpus contacted him and said, if you can find a spot near a lake, not too far from St. Paul, but not in St. Paul, we'd like to rent it. And so Pfeiffer went and figured it out, and he found Idlewild for them. He rented it from a gentleman named Alex Primo, who owned it at the time, and got everything sorted out for $250 in May of 1933. Interestingly, some of the accounts say that when Primo offered a receipt, Pfeiffer refused, saying, "To hell with the receipt." See my problem? And said Primo had the money and Pfeiffer had the cottage. Don't worry about it. We don't need any records. Pfeiffer, like I said, was a fixer who paid off the cops and brokered deals. When he actually was about to be caught and captured, he opted to drink rat poison instead of go to prison. So these are the lives these guys were leading. So they're not necessarily happy moments. It's from Idlewild that it is pretty well agreed that the gang was plotting their kidnapping of William Ham, the heir to the brewery, the Ham's Brewery, and they did kidnap Ham. They actually, according to Karpus, again, because he was the one who was able to tell the stories, he said they got to know so much about the guy as they staked him out and watched his travels and his patterns and his habits and all of that in order to plan the kidnapping. They got to know so much about the guy that Karpus was sick of him long before they actually kidnapped him. I'm sure he loved them too, but whatever. William Ham, as I said, was the heir or part of the Ham's family that had the Ham's beer downtown, and he worked at the brewery. So he would leave his home every morning at the same time and walk down to the brewery, walk home for lunch the same time every day, walk back to the brewery, walk home after work. Everything that they tell you not to do as far as security goes. And so they just literally picked him up off the street one day as he was headed walking along, and took him to a home in Bensonville, Illinois. Took him quite a ways away in Bensonville, Illinois, and demanded a $100,000 ransom. Well, at this point in time, this is, I won't say early in the kidnapping era, it's really not, but for around here, it kind of was. There wasn't a lot of kidnapping going on. It was the spring of 1933, summer of 1933, and at this point in time, it was fairly typical. It was a transaction. You paid the $100,000, you got your person back, it was over. They didn't hurt them. And in fact, in interviews after the fact, William Ham said that they fed him well. They kept him blindfolded, but they fed him well, and they even gave him beer with his sandwiches for lunch, and apologized because it wasn't Ham's beer. So I don't know if that's accurate or not, or if that was a marketing ploy at that point because he had the journalists around. But whatever the case may be, he got returned. They paid the money, he was released, and they moved on. Things were fine. There's the house actually that in later time they figured out was where he was being held. Now they decided about 6 months later, they decided to try again. And this time they doubled the ransom, and they kidnapped Bremer, which gets interesting because they kidnapped Edward Bremer, who was a local banker and the son of Adolf Bremer, who was also a banker and owner of the Schmidt's Brewery in St. Paul. It's entertaining that the brewers during Prohibition are the ones who have the money to pay these ransoms, by the way. But we won't, whatever, I'm not going to analyze that. But they asked for twice as much money. They asked for $200,000. It was interesting because they did the same thing. They paid, they got released. He got released. It was all fine. But all of a sudden they had a ton of attention on them because the Bremer family had been big contributors to FDR's presidential campaign, and FDR put pressure on the federal agents to go after these folks and try to catch them. It was also about that same time, there were a couple other things going on. The Lindbergh baby kidnapping had happened about a year earlier, and people were starting to take on a different sense of kidnapping. They didn't like the idea. They weren't okay with it. It wasn't a harmless sort of process anymore. And then the final piece was really that they had the technology. This was kind of the evolution of the FBI, where they were starting to get into things like fingerprint technology, and albeit it was very slow and challenging compared to what it is today, but still. Now, so a lot of the criminals actually wouldn't engage in kidnapping. They drew the line. Everybody had kind of their own moral code, if you will, and they drew the line. And Dillinger, it is said, was one who was actually asked to take part in this kidnapping, and he refused because he felt that there was something wrong with kidnapping people for money. He did a lot of other things, but he did not want to do that. Now, we don't know for certain that Dillinger was here. We get asked that constantly. It's very likely that he at least came through town. We don't have any specific record of it. We hear all the time that he rented so-and-so's grandma's cottage, or he ate at such and such restaurant, or whatever. What I will tell you is that essentially, he was born and raised in Indiana, and after an attempted robbery at a grocery store, he and his friend had committed, they were busted, and Dillinger confessed. His friend did not. He fought the charges. Dillinger confessed, and the friend ended up serving just 2 years for his crime. Dillinger got a 14-year sentence for confessing, and he ended up serving only 9 years of that, but still served 9 years for attempted robbery of a grocery store. So what's interesting about that, though, is that he was paroled in May of 1933 when he was nearly 30 years old. He was killed in July of 1934. So he had a little over a year to do all the things that he's given credit for doing. And if you think about that, we talk about this all the time. If you think about that, we've estimated that he would have had to move about every 15 minutes from one cottage to the next to actually have stayed in all of them. So a lot of folks did a lot of things that Dillinger got blamed or got credit for sure, as time went on. I really think that he was certainly a higher level gangster. But what we kind of surmise around here is that the really high levels, like the Capones, who you'll see in a second, were notorious and had a following, if you will. Dillinger did, absolutely, but there were also a lot of folks with him. There were a lot of kind of at his level or close to his level, if that makes any sense. So when things happened, when things were done by like your Babyface Nelsons or your Machine Gun Kellys or your others, if they were all roughly the same kind of age group and general level of the gangster hierarchy, it often got blamed on Dillinger. Ma Barker also gets blamed for just about everything any woman ever did, which is entertaining because, again, I don't think she was doing a whole lot on her own. Here's Capone, one of his many, many mugshots. And he actually was probably not here. We don't know for sure. I'll never say never, but I've yet to see anything that convinced me he was. He was so big that he typically traveled with an entourage. If he came to Minnesota, you'd know. If he came to St. Paul, you'd know, or White Bear, you'd know. He was probably in St. Paul. I shouldn't say that he was never there, but I don't think he was probably here in White Bear. He loved northwestern Wisconsin, had lots of places to go there, so he didn't need our lakes. He just really didn't. If he wanted to leave Chicago and get out to the lake, he had other places to go. And interestingly, St. Paul's own Bugs Moran, it was actually sort of the St. Paul's version of Al Capone, and they were heated rivals. So if he came to town, it was definitely an affront to Moran, and then that would usually start some sort of a fight back and forth. Moran was many things. He, interestingly, his moral code said that he was a Catholic boy. He went to Cretan for a time anyway, and his moral code said that he didn't allow prostitution in his gangs. Before you get too enamored with him, I just want to point out that he is also the one who is credited with inventing the concept of the drive-by shooting. So apparently prostitution was no good, but shooting's okay. So again, they all kind of had their own things as time went on. The bank here is an interesting one. This is the Bank of Wilmer, and the photo was taken in 1930. This building, it's not the bank anymore, but if you go out to Wilmer, you can see this building. It still stands in their downtown, and the bullet holes from the bank robbery I'm going to talk about are still there, which is kind of interesting. On July 15th, 1930, two gangsters, Keating and Holden, are said to have shown their gratefulness to Machine Gun Kelly for his help in their escape from Leavenworth by inviting him to participate in robbing the Bank of Wilmer. Included among the bank robbers were Harvey Bailey, Vern Miller, and Sammy Silverman. The bandits escaped with an estimated $70,000, but it was not a clean job. During the robbery, a cashier was pistol whipped, and when a group of onlookers formed outside the bank, one of the gunmen unleashed a burst from his Tommy gun into the crowd, wounding two women. Just 2 weeks later, on August 14th, 1930, 3 men were discovered shot along the road just south of Wildwood Amusement Park. So this is actually the road. You can see the entrance to Catherine Abbott's park there in Matamidi, but if you come off of 244 County Road E there and head south, it's just south of the lakeshore. This is the headline from the White Bear Press that showed up for the account of this story, which says that three men were shot to death near Wildwood. There are multiple versions or variations of the story. It was big news, as you can see from the Minneapolis and the St. Paul papers, and certainly picked up that they were gangsters. Conflicting reports in many ways on who they were, how they were killed, all sorts of things, as you can imagine. But one, essentially, all 3 were shot. One was actually found at the scene unconscious, but not yet dead, but died at the hospital before he could recover, before he came to or regained consciousness. And essentially, nobody knew at the time. Nobody knew what had happened, why this had happened. There were a lot of theories about liquor and hijacking trains and all sorts of things. But as it came back, it was said that this is Wildwood Amusement Park, and obviously an aerial shot of Wildwood Amusement Park on the Matamidi shore of the lake. And if you headed off to the south from the park, you would have found the site of this. It's said that these three fellows had been playing miniature golf at the amusement park. Doesn't sound like a crime. Unfortunately, they had been seen by another gangster, and Machine Gun Kelly, who you see here, was interviewed by the Detroit police in 1934. Completely different situation. So this is 4 years later. But he was being interviewed by the Detroit police, and they were trying to pin together a number of things. Machine Gun Kelly identified Vern Miller, who was part of the Barker Karpus gang, as the killer who committed the triple slaying. You see Vern Miller here. According to Machine Gun Kelly, Miller had robbed the bank in Wilmer with Silverman and the other gangsters. Silverman apparently double-crossed Miller a few weeks later, and then Miller saw him with his friends at the amusement park, followed them out at the end of the night, and shot them. By this time, Miller was already dead. By the 1934, Miller had already died. So when Machine Gun Kelly was telling the story, it didn't matter because Miller was already gone. So he could not confirm nor deny the accusations. But one of Kelly's associates claimed that when not operating with his own gang, Machine Gun Kelly was one of the chief gunmen hired by other gangsters throughout the country and became second only to Vern Miller in notoriety. So the two of them were fairly close in the sense of their characteristics, I guess, if you will. So as we hit 1933, really 34, 35, things are starting to wind down. And it's no coincidence that prohibition is in the process of being repealed at this point. Again, it's really what gave them their power. That's actually why they are going out and kidnapping now, because they're not making as much money off of the bootlegging, and they see the end of that coming. They can't make that profitable. So they're looking for other streams of revenue. Kidnapping is not necessarily working out to be as lucrative as they had thought, but they thought they would try a few things. So essentially, by the end of 1934 and beginning of 1935, most of those higher level gangsters, the ones that we've been talking about that we have mugshots and names of specifically, started to either kill one another in fighting, like we're talking about, or be killed as they were trying to be captured by law enforcement, or in the case of Alvin Karpus, they were able to get him and take him alive. So I mentioned at the beginning, we talked about the three other Barker brothers and their awful demises. Well, Ma and Freddie, you're seen here literally at the morgue, but there's Ma on the side and her son Freddie, who was with her. They ran off to Florida and hid in a house in Florida. And Doc, the one I said was real brilliant, was off elsewhere, and he had been captured with a map in his pocket to the hideout in Florida. So poor Freddie came out shooting, trying to protect Ma, not also the brightest bulb, and they were both killed in the process. So that was January of 1935. So the gang is dwindling rapidly at this point. As I mentioned, J. Edgar Hoover had this whole PR machine out there trying to convince people that Ma Barker was this horrible bandit and this horrible person. Karpus, certainly denies that, but they even had Hollywood engaging in the process, and all these movies were made about Ma Barker and how notorious she was. So interestingly, Karpus, so there's J. Edgar Hoover there on the left, and Hoover started naming the public enemies number one, okay? Interestingly, Karpus is the fourth one named public enemy, but all three of the first 1, 2, 3 were actually killed throughout their process. Interestingly, all of them certainly spent time in St. Paul and potentially spent time out here in White Bear as well. But Karpus is the one who was taken alive. Hoover got a lot of grief for Karpus. He was actually ridiculed by a senator. He was criticized openly by a U.S. senator for not making any of the arrests of the gangsters in general by himself personally. So he insisted on being there when this one happened, and he claimed, he always said that he had personally arrested Karpus, and then he is literally walking him into trial. It's Hoover ducking down sort of there, and Karpus coming into trial at Landmark Center in St. Paul. That's where his trial was, into the federal courthouse in St. Paul. So he was trying to, again, get sort of that notoriety for it. At that trial, Karpus was charged with the Ham and the Bremer kidnappings, and the gangster era, with its sensationalized hunts for wanted criminals, was starting to come to an end. In the end, Karpus was was convicted and sentenced, and he ended up serving his time at Alcatraz, where he was not alone. You can see certainly Capone was there for a time. Machine Gun Kelly, Doc Barker, as we said, he tried to escape Karpus, and the one on the end is actually not a White Bear connected one, I don't think. But that's actually a display they have up at Alcatraz in the museum there that shows those. And it's a little eerie to see when you know they've all been somewhere in our vicinity. But you can see his transition through the years in his mugshots as he aged and made his way through. Karpus is notorious for the fact that he was the only one, again, to survive and to live out his sentence. He was actually paroled from Alcatraz. He was there. He still, well, it's not open, but he holds the record for serving the longest stretch at Alcatraz, and then was paroled and released. You can see him here. He was a Canadian national. He was born in Canada, and so he was deported back to Canada once he was released. And sadly, he ended up dying in Spain. He went to Spain from Canada for whatever reason, and he ended up dying there from a mixture of a deadly cocktail of alcohol and drugs, and it's debated vehemently to this day whether or not it was on purpose or an accident. He was very depressed. There is evidence that he was depressed because, and as you can imagine, we've all probably heard the stories of folks being incarcerated, and when they get out, they don't really know how to live in the regular world, if you will. He was a big deal in Alcatraz. I mean, it sounds sort of weird, but I mean, he was the only public enemy number one to get captured. He made it all the way. And so it's an interesting piece of the story. And so when he got out, it was the 1970s, nobody really cared. And so he was constantly trying to tell his story, and nobody really wanted to know. So it's sort of sad in the end, but you know, kind of goes with what it is. I didn't know if we'd have enough time. I'm going to show you one more thing, which I think is a great story. One of our favorites around here. So again, like I told you at the beginning, we didn't, it's hard to document these stories. It's hard to be able to verify these things. And so we like to vet them. This particular Juniper Street Salon in Matamidi at Juniper and Matamidi Avenue is a hair salon today, but it was at one time Vince Guarnera's Spaghetti Shack. Many from Matamidi will remember that. Well, we heard stories for years that Babyface Nelson and John Dillinger loved Guarnera's spaghetti sauce. Until I was standing at a class reunion with my husband's class, and he graduated with one of the Guarnera grandsons, and he was talking about whatever. We were chatting, and he said something about Grandpa Vince, or no, I don't think it was Grandpa, but it was like his great uncle or something, had come back from World War II and opened his spaghetti shack. Yeah. Oh. World War II was in the 40s. Dillinger was dead in 1934. That doesn't work. So again, we're constantly piecing new bits of information. Now, the one caveat or the one piece that I will give them, or I will say, is that they didn't say he ate it at the spaghetti shack. They just said he loved the spaghetti sauce. So maybe they were making it at home and it served him at their home or something prior to, I don't know. So I won't rule it out completely, but I think it was probably much more of a marketing technique than anything else. So thank you all for being here and for making it work.